Start off with the Clydesdale Bank £5 note. And in some respects, it was when I saw that, I thought to myself, I know who this man was. I wonder how many other people know. So I spoke to some friends and I asked them. They had no idea. They had no idea about the significance of the hammerhead crane. They recognised the Forth Bridge, but they didn't really know that much about the man. But when you start to look at it, you come to a slight confusion. Was he a civil engineer? Was he a mechanical engineer? Was he a bridge builder? He was a member of parliament. Was he a crane maker? Was he a car maker? Because at one time there was the three Scottish cars, all beginning with an A. There was the Arnold Johnson, which we'll talk about slightly. There was the Argyll, and there was the Albion. Albion eventually were the only ones that stayed on, and they went to commercial vehicles. But was he a blacksmith? Or was he a lawyer? Why do so many lawyers know about Arrol? Why do they know the name Arrol? They tend to associate it with the Tancred Arrol. But why do they know about it? This is an extract from the Scottish Engineering Hall of Fame, which is very, very good. And there is one correction I would like to make. You can see it here in red. The original list said that he was awarded the freedom of Ayr. It wasn't Ayr, it was the borough of Ayrshire, so it was significantly more significant. And he was also the freedom of the city of Dundee, etc. So there was all these things here that many people, I'm sure, would be familiar with. But there's a number of other dates that are less familiar. There's this very good painting I see here at the age of 25. Now that was significant. That was the age that he got married to his first wife, Elizabeth Patterson. Now Elizabeth, as you can see, in 1864 when they get married, she originally was a neighbour when they lived in Paisley, and they lived in the Fairfield area. They got to know each other, and William, he started out working in the mills. Very much Paisley and the surrounding area was very much related to the textiles, and he entered into that. But also, he started an apprenticeship as a blacksmith, and he worked his way through. And like many apprenticeships, as was the case recently, when you got to the end of your time, you were paid off. You're looking for work. Now, Sir William Arrol, as he is known now, was just plain William Arrol. He was a blacksmith. He was a very good blacksmith. And he travelled around the country, Scotland and England. For example, when he was given the award of the freedom of the borough of Ayr, he mentioned that he had been there 30 years ago. Now, the information I've managed to find is that he walked to Ayr. There wasn't the same sort of transport that we have now, so he walked here, he walked around the country finding work, and he decided he would like to stay in Ayr, which was one of the main reasons why he decided to choose Ayr to have his house, Seafield House. And see, in 1863 he was employed by Laidlaws as a foreman, and one of the major works that he was involved with there was the construction of Brighton Pier. So he was very much a hands-on person. And as you can see, at that time, he was only 24 years of age, and he was made the foreman. So he must have really known his stuff. He must have been admired by his bosses and by the workforce for them to have him as foreman. A year later, he got married to Elizabeth Patterson. Their first house was on London Road in Glasgow. They had a number of other houses. They then had Oakley Terrace in Denison, which he kept on. But then he bought Seafield House in Ayr. An item that's important here is a Caledonian Railway viaduct. It says here that the start of mechanical engineering and patents, that's when he really started to come into his own. And one of the reasons was he had not a great relationship with riveters. Riveters were making lots and lots of money, and anyone who's involved in the construction industry will know, as soon as a trade know that they are very much important, they will start being less than cooperative, looking for bonuses. That happened at the Caledonian Railway Viaduct leading into Central Station. And at that time, the line ended at Bridge Street, and they decided to make it much more central to Glasgow. So they built Central Station and they built the bridges, and Arrol was involved in the bridges and the actual superstructure of what's now Central Station. But the Caledonian Railway Viaduct became a major problem in that work was not going to contract. It wasn't going as quickly as possible. So he decided to design a hydraulic riveter. The hydraulic riveter was a hydraulic press that pushed the rivets together and inadvertently was better than the riveters, because a hydraulic press could actually hold the rivets until it cooled. That way the plates were much tighter together, whereas the old way was as soon as the riveter got the rivet head on, they left it, and it was intended that the thermal shrinkage of the rivet would pull the plates together. Well, Arrol went one stage further forward and had the rivets produced without riveters. But to be able to do that, while they were doing the Caledonian Bridge, remember at that time, steel was a relatively new material. So you didn't have the same thicknesses that you could get as you can today. So in some places they had occasions where there was 14 thicknesses of plates. Angles and various things had to be riveted together. Up until that time, the normal way was to do punching. The holes would be punched. Arrol decided that the best way to do it would be by drilling. And he would then do a sub-assembly and drill through perhaps up to 14 plates, such that there was a surety of the holes lining through everything. That was a system that he followed on through to many of the riveted works that he was doing. Was the drilling of the holes were done together, such that there was a guarantee that when it came to riveting, the rivets would fit. So that was a very, very important time for Arrol and Arrol's company. Then they started to stand out from the rest. Now, they awarded the fourth bridge contract was Phillips, Falconer, Tancred and Arrol. Arrol was a person who was going to be making this. Phillips effectively became the agent who was in charge of the building of the bridge. Tancred, Falconer, they were mainly people who were good engineers, who were knowledgeable, but they had finance behind them. So for Arrol to take on this work, he helped form this company of Tancred Arrol. Next one, the Buswell Bridge. Now, Buswell Bridge was actually before the Caledonian. The important thing about the Buswell Bridge that some people may remember an event that happened in the 1970s at Milford Haven, where they were jacking a bridge from one side, and before it reached one of the piers, it collapsed. And it collapsed quite severely. It ruined houses. It was quite a mess. And that caused quite a lot of changes to happen in bridge construction. But this was dating back to the 1860s when Arrol decided that this bridge would be too difficult to build in situ, so he built it at one side and launched it. Now, launching a bridge of that shape and size is really quite complex. So to be able to do that, he had to design and build his own hydraulic jacks, because you couldn't go along to the nearest specialist supplier because they didn't exist. So this Buswell viaduct was innovative because building it in one position and jacking it over from one side to the other was not only innovative, it took many a long time before any other competitors could do anything, could have the boldness to do something like that. Now, that indicates to me two things. Arrol was very bold, he was innovative, but he also had a very good team. Because Arrol didn't do all this work all by himself. He had an excellent team who worked along with him, who had the same strength of conviction. And many of those went on to be great engineers in themselves. But Buswell Bridge, Buswell Viaduct, I feel is one of the most innovative bridges that there's been in the UK or elsewhere. The innovations in the fabrication, you can see there's an advert where Arrol's patented hydraulic riveted machines. This here was the jack. This was the hinge position, and this is where the rivets would go. And they were of various sizes in that how far they could actually reach into the structure to do this. There's also the smaller ones. You can see in this picture that is held at Heriot-Watt University. Roland Paxton, some of you may know that he has written a number of good historical stories about engineering in Scotland, but he also wrote an awful lot about the Forth Bridge. There's a very good book by Roland Paxton. Now, you can see that here that the riveters are actually pushing this together. They're getting this assembled in situ. But before it actually arrived there was a works in Kilmarnock that was applying pieces, but there's also a works in South Queensferry where they were doing annealing of steels such that they became more malleable, such that they could actually bend them into shape. And they sub-assembled and do the drill-through process. In some cases, the drill-through would be a double-headed drill that would drill diagonally. It would drill through upwards and downwards, so it would then be pushing against the structure, and there would be a consistency of the holes in the structure. To build the Forth Railway Bridge, if you can imagine the picture of the Forth Railway Bridge where the main foundations are, there's a vertical member coming down, there's a horizontal member from one side, there's a horizontal member from the other side, there's a diagonal member from one side. It was an absolute nightmare, a three-dimensional nightmare. They didn't have three-dimensional AutoCAD in those days. So they built a model. They built about an 8-size model, and that at junction at the bottom of the foundation of the bridge is still held at Heriot-Watt. And to me, it's one of the most innovative things that they did, was to take this very complex structure and sort out the problems before they arrived on site. Moving bridges. There's the Sir William Arrol, that I'm sure many people know, was told that he was being knighted by the Prince of Wales when the Prince of Wales came to drive the brass rivet in the Forth Bridge. He was told that his mother, the Queen Victoria, was going to make Sir William a knight of the realm. Sir William got that knighthood because, as Gordon said in the last presentation we had, he gave his life in many respects to travelling around the country, looking at the Tay Bridge, which tends to be forgotten about. The Tay Bridge was not a simple construction by any manner of means. Sir William Arrol was responsible for the bridge that's still in place, still functioning, and the company took on the whole thing, foundations, piers and all. And to do the foundations, he came up with a very interesting idea. He had a pontoon, and the pontoon had 4 legs on it, and the pontoon would float out, jack up into position. They would then use an air chamber to go down to prepare the foundations and build the structure. And it's still there, it's still working. So he was doing that, but he was also doing Tower Bridge. Tower Bridge is an opening bridge. But he did a number of other moving bridges. On the top left, there's one across the Caledonian Canal. It's actually a rebuild. It was redone in 1938, but it was based upon an original one that was done in the early 1900s. There's also the Shizer rolling lift bascule bridges. He built a number of those. And I'm not sure if left there, and perhaps someone can tell me, did Arrol have the UK licence? Because all the ones I've seen, all the ones I visited while I was working with Arrol, while we were doing repairs to them, they were all Arrol bridges. Whether anyone else had the patent, I know the company, Schneider Company in California, that they had worldwide patents on it. So did Arrol have the patent for the UK? I'm not sure. But this bridge that you can see, the red one in the bottom right-hand corner, that's the one across the River Cart. And that's still in place. It doesn't work so very often, but that's still in place. There's a few still in position, in operation occasionally, like in Hull, but they did the moving bridges. The one on the top left-hand corner, that's a swing bridge. Moving on, they went to cranes. This one looks very different from a bridge, but in actual fact, it's not really that different, because here, the mechanism for this crane to swing is very similar to the mechanism that was used to swing the bridges. Now, this crane Some people may say, well, Arrol's were making cranes, they were making cranes in Rigby Street. This crane was built in 1910. It's John Brown's. It's a significant crane because it was the first of its kind, and it became, in many respects, for shipbuilders, a bit like having a Land Rover is for most construction sites. It's something you must have. And this crane became the must-have for most shipbuilders. And the engineer mainly responsible for that was Adam Hunter, who started as a trainee at the Forth Bridge. He then went on down to Tower Bridge, and often what's known is that while he was in Tower Bridge, he did a number of swing bridges, roller lift bridges in London docks, and that's when they started to get into dock gates. Dock gates is an area that tends not to be talked an awful lot about, but Arrol's were leaders, definitely in the UK, of dock gates. So this bridge, most people will recognise it at John Brown's Yard in Clyde Bank. This was the Fairfield Yard that was in Govan. That crane is no longer there, but these other cranes, this came from the sort of latter part of the Arrol company, long after Arrol had died himself. This one, James Watt Dock in Greenock. That's another important bridge that's still there and still in use. But this one, this Barnley Curl one, this was built mainly for the engines that were constructed in the Barclay Curl area. Many of the engines that were fitted to the ships in the Clyde were lifted in by this crane. The crane that's actually at near the Kingston Bridge at Finniston, that was Kevin Sheldon. That wasn't an Arrow bridge. That was a company based in Carlisle that built that. So this is the part where the link between this, the multiple roller system with the rack and pinion drive, is basically the same for what they use for the swing bridges as they did for the crane. Fundamentally, the mechanism here is the same. So Arrol's had at one point 3 main sections. They had the structural steel, they had the mechanical. Mechanical was doing things like this for moving structures, but also doing coking machines for power stations that were dependent upon coal, the handling of those, and also the hydraulic rams that were used for the riveting, etc., and the cranes. But the cranes came later. Now, how did I get involved in it? I started working at Sir William Arrol as a graduate in 1979, and I was in the engineering office, and for me it was a fantastic apprenticeship because I had fantastic engineers to work with. I was led by fantastic engineers, and we had the advantage of designing our own things like dock gates, moving bridges, roll on, roll off. But we also had the pleasure of taking on the contracting side. Someone else had designed it in its finished state. And I often say that designing a structure in its finished state can sometimes be much easier than how you put it together. Some of the contracts that we won because of our engineering expertise on how do you put this together. Sadly, it was decided that the company was closing, and this book that you can see that was published in 1909, they were being thrown out. I had never seen one before. They were being thrown out, they were being put into a bonfire, and I took one, and I was amazed at all the things that there were in this book and the respect that there was in the industry for the Sir William Arrol company, and obviously for Sir William Arrol himself. One of the corrections that if anyone looked at it, they think it must be a different place, that the actual map within this big book says that the main factory was in Preston Street. That was what it was called when the Arrol Ironworks was formed, but as Glasgow expanded in size, they had a number of double names. So Preston Street became Dunn Street. So 85 Dunn Street, and the majority of Dunn Street in the Bridgeton area of Glasgow was the Sir William Arrol Works. But there's also another important publication that was by Adam Hunter, who was the young apprentice, as I say, that did many important things in London when the London office was established, where he went to night school at what's now London Metropolitan University, where he learned much of the engineering. This book was given to me, and in that book there are so many things, because at that time the British standards didn't exist. There were no British standards for bridges or for major structures. And Adam Hunter drafted this. But I'm quite sure there's the other great engineer, John Hunter, who by that time was running the Arrol's company. I'm sure that he would have a part in that, because he came over from Canada as an apprentice to do a couple of years and then stayed running the company. So I think John Hunter deserves a presentation on his own, because he was also knighted for his services, not within Arrol, but to the war effort during the First World War. If we go on to the Arnold Johnson Car, Arrol was really just a name. Arrol was the person who financed when the MoCar, as it was called, it was a syndicate. When it was actually needing money, he stepped in and he agreed to be the chairman, but he didn't really have a part in it. The main person who ran it was George Johnson. He ran the business. But whether George Johnson was a great person to work for or not, two of his lead engineers left and formed the Albion Company and became a competitor. So it went through various changes. They went through a process where their first factory went on fire and they had to relocate, rebuild. But the Arnold Johnson car actually became a very noted car. In example, it beat the Rolls-Royce entry in the race round the Isle of Man. So some people say that if Arnold Johnson had managed to keep going making cars, he would have been better than the Rolls-Royce. But that's subject to speculation, because they didn't survive. They went through many periods of financial difficulty. By that time, Arnold was moving away from being involved as an engineer as such. So Jane P. Coates, they bought the majority shareholding. Then George Johnson didn't see eye to eye with the Jane P. Coates. So Sir William Beardmore stepped in and he took control. He'd been a shareholder while Jane P. Coates were there, but he took over. And the company went on. It then moved down to Dumfries and Galloway area. It no longer exists, but there's some very, very good examples in the Glasgow Transport Museum of the Arnold Johnson car. Then he became a politician. He first tried to be a politician 2 years after he was knighted, but he lost. It was a close run race, as you can see, that he got 49% against the 51%. So it was a very, very close run thing. But he decided to stay and give it a go. And in the following election, 1895, he won 52% against 48%. He's recorded in Hansard. His first question was to do with the wreck of a steamship, Drummond Castle. Now, Drummond Castle was a ship that sank, and it was mysterious where it sank and why it sank. And there's a big insurance claim, and it went through the House of Commons as ship owners, when they were having difficulties for sinking ships, to claim the insurance money. So he was noted. He was a participant in the debates at the House of Commons. He went on, he won the second time, almost 54% to 46%. So the people of Ayr must have felt that he was a good representative for them. He was very much a liberal, but he was a liberal unionist. He was very much against the separation of Ireland from the United Kingdom. He was very much against Scottish independence. He was much a unionist, as Lloyd George was. Now, when he got married to his second wife, which we'll discuss shortly, the day after he got married, he was in Westminster voting on a key vote, and his fellow MPs were so impressed that they personally contributed, and they gave him a silver cup, and on it was presented to Sir William Arrol, MP, on his marriage by his Unionist colleagues, the House of Commons, in token of their appreciation of his high sense of duty and conspicuous loyalty. Him and his wife, the day after they got married, got on a train. They got to London in time for him to get a vote. That was how committed he was. As you can see, that he was married 3 times. He was married to Elizabeth Patterson. He never had any family with Elizabeth. Elizabeth, whether it's subject to conjecture of what the cause was, but she suffered from mental health. When they were living in Glasgow at the early stage of his career, and it was evident they weren't going to be having children, she started to show signs of mental health disorders. And in those days, there was less understanding for it, and quite often people would be committed. She was committed to Gap Naval Hospital for a period of time, and she didn't actually go down to join him at Seafield House because she was in Gap Naval Mental Institution for almost a year. However, he stuck by her, and her sister's daughter, Cecilia, came to live with Arrol and with Elizabeth when she was 5 years of age, and she stayed there and helped, you could say, you could help Elizabeth cope with her mental disorders. When Cecilia married and moved away and moved back to the Oakland Terrace house that Arrol had bought with Elizabeth many years before, he had kept on and family members had used that. When she moved away, Arrol employed a mental health nurse who stayed with her, kept an eye on her. She died of a heart attack. It was natural causes. Before she died, Sir William Arrol had many events he had to attend, and Lady Arrol couldn't accompany him, so he took his cousin, Elizabeth Hodgert. Elizabeth Hodgert went for almost 2 years accompanying him. So when Elizabeth died, Sir William married his cousin, Janet. Their marriage didn't last very long, only 5 years, and then he married Elsie Robinson. Now, Elsie Robinson was only 35 years of age. She was a spinster. Janet had been a spinster before. Elsie was a spinster, but she was the daughter of Ian Robertson, who was also an MP. And Elsie, when they married, was in London. They were married for a relatively short time, only 3 years. When Sir William Arrol died, in his will, he made a commitment stating that the marriage contract should be honoured. And the marriage contract was effectively that Elsie was to have a pension for the rest of her life. She didn't inherit Seafield, but she had a pension for the rest of her life, and she moved back down to London, where she stayed, and she was notable, seemingly during the Second World War, at providing for those people who had been bombed, that were homeless, etc., providing foods and whatnot. So, as I said, he'd been made Freeman of Dundee, Freeman of Ayrshire. Now, the important thing in both of those, in his acceptance speeches, he made comment that he was against the command of one union against the other, not the unionist as far as the countries are concerned, but the union as far as the trades were concerned. He was very much against them. He was a member of Parliament, he was a unionist, and when he died, he decided that he wanted to be buried with his first 2 wives, who were buried in Paisley. This is an extract from the Glasgow Herald at the time. Arrol had not really been involved with the company for almost 15 years, but they laid on a train from Glasgow for the people of the company, Sir William Arrol and Co., to come to his funeral. He was a very, very popular man. He was also very popular in Ayr. Similarly, they lined the streets of Ayr when he was being transported from Seafield House to Ayr railway station. He was very, very popular there. The name is still very popular there. Seafield House became a a nursing home. It became, in the First World War, a convalescence for war wounded. But in the area, there's Arrol Drive, there's Arrol Health Centre. The name still persists. So he must have been a very well-liked person. The house is not in this condition. It's in a rather bad state. But when he died, the sum that he left is in modern equivalent about £37 million in today's money, which is a substantial sum of money. But he made good use of that money in his will, mainly to 7 members of his family. His 2 sisters were named as executors. He left money to Glasgow University because Glasgow University had given him an honorary doctorate of law because of the work he did, and because you could argue about the significance of the Tancred Arrol law case. Now, the Tancred Arrol law case was mainly against Scottish Steel, because Scottish Steel were by far the biggest producer of steel in Scotland. They almost had a monopoly. They tried to have a monopoly. But the Tancred Arrol Company made an agreement with Scottish Steel that they would supply them with the steel that they needed for the Forth Bridge. And it was estimated the Forth Bridge would be about 30,000 tonnes of steel. In the end, they only bought 10,000 tonnes of steel from Scottish Steel. So Scottish Steel wanted their share, they felt. So they took Tancred Arrol to court. It went through the lower courts, then it went to the Court of Session in Edinburgh, then it went to London for the Court of Appeal. And Tancred Arrol won, because Scottish Steel were saying, normally, if someone says that this is about 30,000 tonnes, then we should expect to get the whole of that 30,000 tonnes. And the law case was proven against them. They lost. And strangely enough, within 2 years, Scottish Steel no longer existed. It must have cost them an absolute fortune. So many lawyers will know the Tancred Arrol, but not really know the significance of the name of Arrol. His gardener, John McCartney, while he was still working as a gardener, he lived in Seafield Lodge. When he retired, Sir William Arrol didn't kick him out. He told him to stay there. And he's told his family to stay there for as long as they liked. And he included that in the will, that as long as that family wanted to stay in that gatehouse to keep the gate, they should stay there. So it's a very generous action, I feel. Now, in Seafield House, you can see there's a tower. In the tower, Sir William Arrol used to follow one of his hobbies, astronomy. He had a telescope, and he used to watch the sky when he could. Being west of Scotland, that was relatively limited, but he would do that. But other times, he would read. And he was a Burns aficionado. He was the president of the Burns Air Club. That's quite a significant place to be the president of a Burns club in Ayr. And seemingly he could recite a great quantity of Burns' work in the natural tongue, and very well. He also played the fiddle until he broke his finger while he was a blacksmith. He couldn't play the fiddle, but he loved music. So, Sir William Arrol, we, the Hammermen, are still doing the Arrol Trust Award each year. So the money is continuing to be used well. He was very much, in my view, a philanthropist. I will end there, saying that I think Arrol is a man, he was a great engineer, a great entrepreneur, but he must have been a very nice man as well. I believe that if you crossed his path, he would let you know that you'd crossed his path, but I believe very strongly that Sir William Arrol was a very generous man, and he left fantastic legacies.